This question appeared on a recent video about how to use events in VBA to automatically change the width of columns as you enter data in Excel. In that video, we showed you how to make that work for a single worksheet, but one of our viewers wanted to know how to make it work for multiple worksheets in the workbook, or even for other workbooks entirely. Now, this is something we have covered in a previous video in the VBA series, but it's always nice to revisit some classic ideas and give a slightly different example to show how they work. So let's have a look at how we can enable application level events in Excel. To get started, I've created a brand new blank Excel workbook, and just to recap the original problem, what I want to happen is whenever I enter a value into a cell, I want the width of that column to automatically change to match the widest entry. To make that work on a single worksheet is pretty straightforward. If we head to the Developer tab and then open up the Visual Basic Editor, I want to access the events of the Sheet 1 object, so I can double-click on that in the Project Explorer on the left-hand side. And then from the top of the code window, I can use the drop-down lists to select the events of the Worksheet object. So I'll start by selecting Worksheet from the left-hand drop-down list, and then the event that I want isn't selection change, that's the default event of the worksheet. That's triggered whenever I select a different cell. The one that I want is just called change, and that's fired whenever I change the content of a cell. So I can delete the selection change event, I won't need that. And then inside the change event, I can add some code to refer to the target cell. So that's a built-in parameter which refers to the cell whose value I've changed. And then from there I can refer to the entire column property. And then from there I can apply the auto fit method. So that's all I need to do to make that work on one single worksheet. If I head back to the Excel workbook now and start typing in content in cells, the width of the column changes automatically to match the widest entry currently in that column. Now, of course, that only happens on sheet 1 at this point. If I added a new worksheet and tried the same thing here, nothing will happen. So one option here, I suppose, is we could head back into the Visual Basic Editor and then copy the event procedure into the Sheet 2 object, but that seems like a bit of a waste of time. Let's do it this way instead. I'm going to copy the instruction I added to the change event, and then I'm just going to delete that procedure altogether. Instead, I'm going to then go to the This Workbook object, so I can double-click this workbook on the left-hand side, and then I can access events of the entire workbook object using the same technique I used for the worksheet. So from the drop-down list at the top left-hand corner, I'm going to select Workbook. That gives me the Open event, which is the default event of a workbook object. But from the drop-down list on the right-hand side, I can then choose the Sheet Change event. So this is the same change event as we saw for a worksheet, but it applies to every worksheet in the entire workbook. I can then delete the Workbook Open event, paste in the code that I copied to the Workbook Sheet Change event. I've still got this built-in target parameter you can see. I've also got an extra parameter called sh, which gives me access to the worksheet that contains the cell that I've just changed, but we don't need to worry about that right now. Let's head back into the workbook, and then let's start changing the content of cells in a worksheet. It doesn't matter which one this time, whichever worksheet I'm on, even if it didn't previously exist, will automatically change the width of the column to match the widest entry in it when I enter the data. So that's great as long as you only care about this event happening in this single workbook, Book 1. As soon as I insert a new workbook, I'll press Ctrl and N on the keyboard to quickly do that. You'll find that that event no longer has any effect because it's tied into a specific workbook. So the rest of the video is going to show you how you can make the same event fire for any workbook that you have open. Okay, so to demonstrate the next part, I've reverted to a brand new blank Excel workbook. So currently there are no event procedures in here. Entering a value in a cell has no effect. The first step in getting application level events to work is to create a class module. So to do that, let's head back into the Visual Basic Editor, and then I'm going to right click in the Project Explorer and choose Insert Class Module. We can call our class pretty much whatever we want. I'm going to call mine Excel Events Class. What I'd now like to be able to do is select the equivalent of the worksheet or the workbook object, but referring to an application object from this drop-down list at the top left-hand corner. At the moment I can't do that. The only thing I can pick here is the class itself, and that just gives me the two basic class events, initialize and terminate, neither of which are useful to us. To add an item to this drop-down list at the top, we need to declare a public variable of the appropriate type. So let's declare a variable that can hold a reference to an application object. So I'm going to call this one public, and then Excel events app as an application. Now that by itself isn't sufficient to make that object appear in the drop-down list. In order to make it appear up here, the variable needs to be declared with events. So if we say public with events, and then click on the drop-down list at the top, now we suddenly have access to an application object. And then once we select that, we get access to all of the events of that application object. So you'll see again, we get a default event. It's called new workbook. This is one that fires every time you insert a new workbook in Excel. There are lots of other events exposed here as well, ones we've not seen previously with the workbook and worksheet events. But we're going to revert to the original sheet change event, the one that we just used at the workbook level previously. I can then remove the new workbook event. I won't need that. And then again, I can just add the same basic code we added before to say target dot entire column dot auto fit. And that's the basics of creating the event procedure. Now, this is where things get a little trickier if you haven't worked with class modules before. With our built-in workbook and worksheet events that we used earlier, you saw that as soon as you added the code to the event procedure, it was automatically live. But that's not quite the same with our class module. If I switch back into the Excel workbook and start typing things into cells, when I press enter, absolutely nothing happens whatsoever. The problem is that our class module is just a blueprint for a type of object. It isn't an object itself. If I want these events to fire, I need to have an object that the events are attached to. So I need to create a new instance of my class module, and then I need to set the Excel events app public variable to refer to an instance of the application object. So it sounds more complicated than it actually is in terms of the amount of code you have to write. Let's have a quick go. I'm going to insert a new module into the project, and then let's declare a variable that we can reference in any subroutine in this module. I'm going to say dim my Excel events, and the type of object is going to be a new instance of my Excel events class. So now whenever I reference this variable in my code, it's going to either create a new instance of my events class, or if one already exists, it's going to reference the existing version of that. Now I need to create a subroutine that I can run that will assign the application object, so the Excel application, to the Excel events app variable in my class module. So let's create a new subroutine. We'll give it a sensible name that describes what's actually happening to an end user. So I'm going to say activate. Sorry, I'll spell that properly eventually. Activate application level events. So putting it in plain English, I hope. To make that happen, we're going to say set my Excel events dot Excel events app equals application. So the application keyword is referring to the running instance of Microsoft Excel. Now what I need to do is run this subroutine to make everything work. So if I run that subroutine and then head back to the Excel workbook, now when I start typing values into cells, it's going to change the width of columns when I press enter. And that's going to work for any worksheet in this workbook. But also, really interestingly, if I press Ctrl and N to create a brand new blank workbook, when I enter values into those cells, the same code also works. So now that our application level events are active, they will remain active until we either close down Excel or until this variable is destroyed or set to nothing. It might be handy to have a manual way to deactivate your application level events as well. And a quick and simple way to do that would be just to copy this subroutine we've just written, paste it in just below, and then I'll change its name to call it deactivate application level events. And then I'll set the public variable in that module, or in that class module, Excel events app, to be equal to nothing. Okay, So at this point, I'm just going to run that subroutine and that'll deactivate all of my events if there were any currently active. Just to describe what's happening in a little bit more detail, perhaps, if I were to go back to my Activate Application Level Events procedure and hit the F8 key to begin stepping through it. In my Locals window, if you can't see this by the way, you can go to the View menu and choose Locals window, wherever it is, there it is. And then if I expand the Module 1 object, you'll see that I've got my Excel events, and currently my Excel events app variable is set to nothing. So at this point, I can't fire any events attached to that object. If I continue stepping through this procedure, we'll see that the word nothing disappears and my Excel events app variable is now set to something. So when that's true, if I switch into any workbook, type a value into any cell and press enter, the event fires. If I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then I click into my Deactivate Application Level Event procedure, if I hit the F8 key to begin stepping through it, and then in the Locals window, just expand my Module 1, then my Excel events, I can see that Excel Events app isn't currently nothing, so it must be referring to some sort of object. But if I step through this procedure, I'll see that eventually it now becomes nothing, and that deactivates all the events. So now typing values into cells no longer does anything. So at the moment, all of the code required to enable my application level events is held in the Book 1 workbook. And if I ever wanted to be able to access this code again, I'd need to save this workbook and then reopen it each time I wanted to enable my application level events and then manually run that subroutine, which seems like a bit of a faff to me. I think there's a much more streamlined way we can do this. I want all of the code that we've got in the Book 1 object to exist in the Personal Macro workbook. If you haven't dealt with the Personal Macro workbook before, it's just a special Excel workbook that opens up automatically every time you open up Excel. There are several ways you can create it, but by far the most convenient is to go to the Excel workbook, head to the Developer tab in the ribbon, and then just choose to record a macro. It doesn't matter what you call your macro because we're not actually going to make it do anything. All I care about is that we've selected the Personal Macro Workbook as the storage option here. So you can simply click OK, and then you can immediately stop recording. That's sufficient to get the Personal Macro Workbook to exist. If I now switch back into the Visual Basic Editor, I can see this new personal.xlsb workbook. You don't see that in Excel itself, it's a hidden workbook. The point is you don't add any worksheets and charts and cells to it. You just add the code that you want to be available to every instance of Excel you open up. Let's just tidy up a little bit as well. I'm going to close down my Book 2 workbook and I'm not going to bother saving any changes to that. And then back in the Visual Basic Editor, what I now want to do is get a copy of all the code from my Book 1 project into the Personal Macro Workbook. The simplest thing to do here is just click and drag. I'm going to drag my class module from my Book 1 project somewhere onto the Personal project, and that creates a duplicate of it. I can then take Module 1 and do the exact same thing, and we'll see that we get, actually I should have pointed out first of all, the basic macro that we recorded that didn't actually do anything actually created a separate module for me called Module 1. It's got that empty macro in it. I should have deleted that one first. Let's just remove it now. We won't need anything in there. So yeah, I've got a module called Module 11 at this point, but its name doesn't really matter. The fact is it's got the two subroutines I care about. Okay, so just to show how this works, let's save our Personal Macro Workbook. I'm just going to select anything in that project and then hit the Save button in the Visual Basic Editor. Then let's go back into Excel and close down the Book 1 object. I don't care about saving that one. I've got all the code I need already stored. Then I'm going to go and reopen Excel and then create a brand new blank workbook. And I'll find if I look in the Developer tab and the Visual Basic Editor that my Personal Macro Workbook has opened up automatically. And that means that I can run the subroutine to activate my application level events, either from within the Visual Basic Editor, or if I prefer, from the Developer tab in Excel, head to Macros, and then activate application level events. We could even create a button in the Quick Access toolbar, or a tab in the ribbon to do this with a button click, or a keyboard shortcut even. Anyway, the point is now that my auto column width code is running in this new workbook, and any subsequent one that I create is now working again. I think the only thing that I'm still not entirely happy about with this system is that I have to manually run the subroutine to enable my application level events. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just make that happen automatically whenever we open up Excel? Well, we can actually just go back to using standard workbook level events to do that. If you think about it, if I switch back into the Visual Basic editor, the personal macro workbook is just a workbook that opens up automatically whenever you open up Excel. So if I look at the Excel objects of the personal macro workbook, I've got a this workbook object. I can double click on that. I can access the workbook object from the drop down list at the top, which generates the default event procedure, workbook open. And then from within there, I can call on any subroutine in the module. So let's look at the activate application level events procedure. So whenever this personal macro workbook opens up, it triggers that subroutine to enable the application level events automatically. Let's give that a try. I'm going to save my personal macro workbook again. And then I'm going to close down book 1. I don't care about saving any changes to that. That's not important. And then go back and reopen Excel again. Create a brand new blank workbook. And I should see that immediately, as soon as I start typing values into cells, then the width of the column changes automatically. So there you go, the complete system in place, nice and streamlined way to get your column widths to change automatically whenever you're working in Excel. Hope that one was useful. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.